Violet Renbury learned the nature of her welcome before a single course was served. The Duke's London townhouse glittered with candlelight and polished silver, yet the space allotted to her was a narrow island at the far end of the dining room, distant from the long table where authority gathered. Her name was spoken softly, almost apologetically, as she was guided to the place set for her, a place that announced usefulness without belonging. She wore a modest cream muslin gown with a narrow ribbon beneath the bust, chosen for restraint, her hair arranged in a low Regency knot that revealed composure even as her pulse quickened. The message was unmistakable. She was to be present, not seen. Conversation rose and fell like practiced music. Violet lowered her gaze, steadying herself, recalling the discipline learned over years of gentle exclusion. She would not betray discomfort. She would not invite correction. The distance between her chair and the Duke's table was measured, deliberate, and meant to instruct. It told her who mattered and who was tolerated. She accepted the lesson in silence, unaware that across the room, Duke Edwin Kingswell had noticed not her presence, but the calculated absence created around it. Edwin presided with habitual detachment, dark coat immaculate, expression composed. He had endured countless dinners identical in form and expectation, evenings designed to reinforce order rather than pleasure. Yet as the servants withdrew and conversation settled, his attention snagged on a dissonance he could not immediately name. Something was wrong with the symmetry of the room. His gaze traced the length of the table, then the margins beyond it, until it found the solitary figure set apart. Violet sat with her hands folded, posture unassailable, accepting isolation with a dignity that unsettled him. He did not know her name. He knew only that the arrangement felt intentional, and therefore unjust. A flicker of irritation stirred, unwelcome and precise. Edwin found himself watching her instead of the speakers nearest him, noting the calm of her expression, the stillness that suggested endurance rather than submission. The sensation was unfamiliar. He was a man trained to overlook the small accommodations of hierarchy, yet now he could not. The room seemed to tilt, the rituals suddenly exposed as fragile constructions upheld by habit alone. When Violet lifted her eyes briefly, their gazes met. The moment lasted no longer than a breath, but it carried consequence. Violet felt it like a change in air pressure, an awareness she had not prepared for, and she looked away at once, heart steady but alert. Edwin did not. Something in him shifted, quiet but irrevocable. Before the first dish reached the table, before a single word passed between them, the order of the evening had already begun to fracture, and neither of them yet understood how completely it would change everything. Outside, the city waited, indifferent and immense, while within those walls a future shifted, quietly, decisively, toward a choice neither had intended that night alone. Morning did not soften the lesson of the previous night. It made it sharper. Violet rose before the household fully stirred, when the corridors held the cool scent of stone and beeswax and the curtains still kept London at a polite distance. She dressed with quiet exactness in a butter-yellow muslin day gown, plain at the bodice, lightly trimmed at the cuffs, and fastened with a narrow white ribbon beneath the high waist. Her chestnut hair was drawn back into a smooth Regency coil at her nape, and two soft tendrils escaped at her temples. She refused the safety of dull colors, but she also refused to flaunt. If she must be placed at the edge of other people's regard, she would at least choose her own form of restraint. By breakfast she understood that the distance at dinner had not been an accident but an instruction, and the house repeated it in smaller ways that were easier to deny and therefore harder to confront. People addressed her as one addresses a useful object, with efficiency and without curiosity. The housekeeper asked her to copy a list of linens, then to carry a sealed note to a tradesman, then to sit with an elderly aunt who disliked solitude and delighted in correction, and each request arrived, wrapped in civility so thin it could not warm. A footman poured tea for the nearer ladies first, and only then turned toward Violet with a hurried apology that sounded more like correction than care. Violet thanked him anyway, because gratitude was expected, and because to refuse would be to invite the very attention she had learned to fear. In the drawing room she heard a laugh break, then stop, as though someone remembered she might listen, and the small pause told her more than any insult could that day. Edwin Kingswell did not summon her, but he began to notice her with a focus that startled him. In the library, while he worked through correspondence, his gaze lifted again and again from ink to movement, bodies angling to exclude Violet, conversation narrowing the moment she approached, a servant hesitating before offering her a chair, waiting for permission that should never have been required. The calm on Violet's face did not read as acceptance to him. It read as restraint demanded by circumstance, and he felt a precise irritation at the ease with which his household enforced it. Near midday he met her at a turn in the corridor, papers balanced in her hands. She dropped into a curtsy, eyes lowered, expecting him to pass, but he paused. "Miss Renbury," he said, the name spoken as if it had always belonged there. "Take your tea in the library this afternoon." It was phrased like a request, yet it sounded like a decision. Violet lifted her eyes, surprised by the simple fact of being addressed, and Edwin walked on before she could decide whether the warmth in her chest was gratitude or warning. Edwin Kingswell had long believed that discipline was the same as virtue. It had been taught to him early, reinforced through years of inheritance, instruction, and expectation, until restraint felt less like a choice and more like the natural order of things. His mornings unfolded with predictable precision, correspondence reviewed at the escritoire, estate matters weighed without indulgence, social obligations acknowledged but rarely welcomed. He dressed that day in a dark blue coat, severe in cut, linen immaculate, each detail reflecting a life arranged to avoid excess. Nothing in his habits allowed for disruption, and yet disruption had already taken hold. The image of Violet Renbury, seated apart the night before, returned with unwelcome clarity. It was not her isolation alone that unsettled him, but the way it had been engineered so neatly that no one questioned it. He recognized the mechanism too well. He had benefited from such structures all his life, moving easily through rooms designed to receive him, never once considering who had been placed outside their center to preserve that ease. The realization did not arrive as guilt, but as irritation, sharp and exacting. He disliked inefficiency. He disliked injustice, disguised as custom even more. As the household settled into its rhythm, Edwin found himself watching for Violet with a focus he did not attempt to disguise from himself. He noticed how she moved through rooms without hesitation, yet never lingered where she was not invited, how she listened without inserting herself, how her expression remained composed even when her presence was treated as optional. There was nothing theatrical in her restraint. That was what disturbed him. He had known women who performed humility as currency, who waited to be elevated as reward. Violet did neither. She simply endured, and endurance, he knew, was not the same as acceptance. When she entered the library later that afternoon, invited by his own instruction, Edwin observed her as one observes a phenomenon not yet understood. She wore the butter-yellow gown again, its color soft but deliberate, and her hair was arranged with care that suggested self-respect rather than display. She thanked him for the tea, her voice steady, and took the chair indicated without presumption. Edwin noted how easily she followed direction without shrinking beneath it, a balance few managed. Conversation unfolded cautiously. They spoke of books, of the city, of nothing that mattered, and everything that revealed. Violet did not flatter. She did not retreat. She answered when addressed and fell silent when silence was appropriate, and Edwin found the exchange more bracing than any argument he had entertained in years. When she left, the room felt altered, as though something essential had passed through and left its mark. Edwin returned to his papers, but the words blurred. He understood then that what unsettled him was not Violet's presence, but his own response to it. She had revealed a flaw in the order he maintained, a quiet fault line running beneath years of unquestioned habit. He could ignore it, as he had ignored so much before, or he could examine it. The thought lingered, precise and unwelcome. By evening, Edwin knew that discipline alone would no longer suffice, and that knowledge marked the true beginning of his undoing. The second formal dinner was announced with the same ceremony as the first, yet Violet felt the difference before she crossed the threshold. Anticipation tightened the air, not with promise, but with vigilance. She dressed carefully in a soft peach evening gown, the fabric light enough to move when she did, the color chosen for warmth rather than boldness. Her hair was arranged in a low chignon, smooth and precise, with restrained curls brushed back from her temples. She told herself the preparations were practical, not hopeful. Expectation, she had learned, was a luxury. The dining room revealed its order at once. The long table gleamed beneath the chandeliers, places set with deliberate symmetry. Violet's name was again directed toward the far end, her chair angled just so, distant enough to be unmistakable. She accepted the instruction without pause, settling into the seat allotted, hands folded, expression composed. The ritual began to unfold around her, servants moving in practiced lines, conversation rising with careful animation. She lowered her gaze, steadying herself against the familiar sting, reminding herself that endurance had always been her shield. Then the rhythm broke. Edwin Kingswell rose from his chair without announcement. The movement cut cleanly through the room, drawing attention not through force but through certainty. Violet felt it before she saw it, a sudden stillness that pressed against her awareness. Edwin stepped away from the table and crossed the floor with unhurried intent. He stopped beside her chair, placed one hand upon its back, and drew it out. The sound was soft, unmistakable. He turned, met her eyes, and inclined his head slightly, the gesture restrained yet irrevocable. For a heartbeat, Violet did not move. Every lesson she had learned urged caution. Visibility had consequences, yet to refuse would be to reject something offered not as indulgence, but as fact. She rose, her movements measured, and crossed the space to his side. Edwin guided the chair into place beside his own, and waited until she was seated before returning to his position. He did not explain. He did not look around to gauge reaction. The room remained suspended, then resumed its breath as though nothing had occurred, though everything had. Violet's pulse steadied as the weight of the moment settled. Gratitude flickered, edged with fear. She kept her posture impeccable, her expression serene, determined not to betray uncertainty. Edwin resumed conversation as if the arrangement had always been so, yet his presence beside her felt charged, deliberate. She sensed eyes upon her, measuring, questioning, recalculating. The chair at her side had become a declaration, and declarations carried cost. Edwin felt the cost keenly and accepted it without flinch. The act had not been impulse, it was correction. As the meal progressed, he remained composed, but awareness sharpened within him. He had disrupted more than seating. He had named an injustice by refusing it, and in doing so, he had bound Violet to him in public regard. Across the table, custom adjusted reluctantly, and Edwin knew that nothing would return to its former place. By morning, the house had learned a new posture. Violet sensed it in the pauses that followed her steps, in the way glances lingered before being carefully redirected, in the sudden politeness sharpened to a blade's edge. She dressed with deliberate calm in a lavender day gown, the color gentle but unmistakably chosen, her hair smoothed into a precise Regency knot that allowed no stray softness. If scrutiny was to follow her now, she would meet it without apology. The chair drawn out the night before had not been returned to its place, and the absence it left behind pressed on the household like a held breath. At breakfast, conversation resumed around her with exaggerated normality. A cousin asked after her comfort with studied warmth, an inquiry designed to remind Violet that concern could be performed without granting belonging. She answered with equal courtesy, neither inviting familiarity nor retreating from it. A servant hesitated before offering her tea, then corrected himself quickly, flushing as though unsure which rule now governed her presence. Violet accepted the cup with steady hands, aware that every gesture was being weighed for presumption or gratitude. The balance was narrow, but she walked it with practiced care. Edwin observed these shifts from a distance, saying little, doing nothing to soften the disruption he had introduced. His silence was intentional. He understood the language of households well enough to know that explanation would weaken the act, turning it into justification rather than fact. He dressed that morning in a dark brown coat, severe and unadorned, and attended to his correspondence as though nothing had changed. Yet his attention tracked Violet's movement through rooms, noting how she absorbed scrutiny without flinching. The restraint he admired now carried a new weight, for it was no longer merely survival. It was endurance under observation. Later, in the drawing room, a remark edged too close to implication, suggesting Violet's placement had been a temporary convenience. Edwin looked up at once. He did not raise his voice. He did not rebuke. He simply met the speaker's gaze and allowed silence to stretch until the meaning of the comment withered under its own exposure. The conversation shifted. Violet felt the intervention like a hand at her back, unseen but steady. Relief stirred, followed by unease. Protection, she knew, always demanded its price. That evening, alone at her small escritoire, Violet allowed herself a single moment of stillness. Gratitude warred with caution, warmth with fear. Being noticed was dangerous. Being chosen was more so. She did not yet know which she had become. Across the house, Edwin paused at his window, the city's lights flickering beyond the glass. He recognized that the chair he had drawn out could not be pushed back unnoticed. Whatever followed would demand intention, not impulse. The household had shifted. So had he. Violet's history had taught her how to remain unremarkable without becoming invisible, a skill acquired not through choice but necessity. She had been raised with the manners of a gentlewoman and the expectations of one, yet without the fortune that secured such expectations against erosion. Her childhood had been orderly, affectionate in its own restrained way, until illness and debt hollowed it quietly from within. By the time she was old enough to understand what had been lost, she had already learned how to soften her presence so others would not feel the need to correct it. That instinct followed her now through every room of the Duke's house, even as her position within it shifted. She spent the late morning in a small sitting room overlooking the street, copying correspondence at the request of a relation who preferred delegation to effort. Violet wore a pale ivory gown trimmed with the faintest blue embroidery at the cuffs, the color chosen for clarity rather than modesty. Her hair was arranged beneath a simple cap, pinned neatly, practical without severity. The task itself was familiar, the quiet industry comforting in its predictability. What unsettled her was not the work, but the awareness that it was now observed. She sensed attention where there had once been indifference, and the change left her uncertain how carefully she must move. Edwin encountered her by chance as she finished the last page, the sound of his steps pausing in the doorway. He did not announce himself. He watched for a moment, noting the precision of her hand, the calm focus that required no audience. When she looked up, surprise flickered briefly across her expression before she composed it away. He remarked on the clarity of her script, nothing more, yet the acknowledgement carried weight. Violet thanked him, her voice steady, and returned to her work as though praise were an ordinary occurrence. Edwin recognized the effort beneath that composure and felt a quiet admiration sharpen into resolve. Later, alone in his study, Edwin reflected on what he had begun to understand. Violet's restraint was not born of timidity but of long habit, shaped by circumstances that rewarded silence and punished expectation. He saw in her a discipline equal to his own, though forged through very different means. The realization unsettled him more deeply than attraction ever could. It challenged the narrative he had accepted about order and merit, about who deserved ease and who endured without complaint. Violet did not ask to be chosen. She had learned too well the cost of hoping. That afternoon, Violet allowed herself a brief walk in the garden, the cool air easing the tightness in her chest. She removed her cap, letting the breeze brush loose a few strands at her temples, and for a moment she felt unobserved. Yet even there, beneath the open sky, the weight of change followed her. Being seen had altered the ground beneath her feet. Endurance had once been enough. Now it was being tested by possibility, and Violet understood that possibility could be as dangerous as exclusion. The invitation arrived without ceremony, spoken rather than written, offered in a tone that allowed refusal without inviting it. Edwin encountered Violet in the late afternoon as she passed through the smaller drawing room, sunlight slanting across the carpet in pale bands. He suggested a walk in the garden before dusk, citing the mildness of the weather and the benefit of air after hours indoors. The words were ordinary. The intention beneath them was not. Violet hesitated only long enough to gather herself, then inclined her head in acceptance, aware that declining would alter the meaning of his regard in ways she was not prepared to test. She changed with care, choosing a pale sky blue walking dress that moved easily, its simplicity offset by a narrow white sash. Her hair was arranged in a low Regency knot, practical and neat, though a few soft strands escaped at her temples when she stepped outside. The garden was quiet, the city's noise held at a respectful distance by brick walls and hedges newly trimmed. They walked side by side without haste, the gravel crunching softly beneath their steps, neither pressing conversation too soon. Edwin spoke first, remarking on the season, on the balance required to keep the grounds orderly without erasing their life. Violet responded with measured interest, adding an observation about a late-blooming shrub near the path. The exchange was careful, exploratory. They spoke of duty without naming burden, of expectation without complaint. Violet found herself answering more freely than she intended, drawn out by the absence of judgment in his attention. Edwin listened without interruption, a discipline he did not always extend so readily, and felt something within him ease at the sound of her voice unguarded. As they turned beneath an arch of climbing roses, Violet became aware of the subtle shift in her own posture. She was no longer braced for dismissal. She walked as though her presence was assumed rather than permitted, and the realization startled her. Edwin noticed it too, the quiet confidence emerging when she was not required to defend herself. He asked her opinion on a matter of household arrangement, not as test but as inquiry, and Violet answered with clarity that surprised them both. The moment passed without emphasis, yet it marked something essential. When they paused near the far end of the garden, the light thinning toward evening, silence settled comfortably between them. Violet felt the weight of the day ease, replaced by cautious warmth. Edwin understood that the walk had achieved what no declaration could. It had placed them in shared space without hierarchy, if only briefly. As they returned toward the house, Violet was aware that something had been permitted, not by him alone, but by herself. The boundary she had guarded so carefully had shifted, not broken, and Edwin sensed that this quiet allowance would demand more of him than any public gesture yet made. The change did not announce itself. It arrived in increments so small they might have been dismissed as coincidence had Violet not been trained by necessity to notice shifts in atmosphere. Doors that once closed without pause now remained open a moment longer. Invitations were phrased less as instruction and more as inclusion. She dressed that morning in a soft rose-tinted day gown, the color gentle yet deliberate, her hair arranged in a smooth knot with a few curls left loose at her temples, and she felt the eyes that followed her movements with new attentiveness. Being seen, she discovered, carried a weight entirely different from being dismissed. Resistance emerged just as quietly, a request made through Violet rather than to her, a reminder delivered with a smile about where her responsibilities lay, none of it overt, all of it precise. She met each instance with composure, refusing to retreat, yet careful not to provoke. Her silence became intentional, her courtesy exact. What unsettled her most was not the correction, but the knowledge that it was no longer solely hers to bear. Edwin noticed. He noticed the way conversation altered when she entered a room, the way glances sharpened, the way deference was offered selectively, as though testing the limits of his earlier disruption. He responded without spectacle. When Violet was excluded from a discussion regarding the evening's arrangements, Edwin redirected it, asking her opinion as though it were expected. When a pause lingered before a chair was offered, he gestured subtly, removing uncertainty before it could settle. These interventions were small, almost invisible, yet Violet felt them distinctly, like steady pressure at her back. Gratitude stirred, edged again with unease. Protection, she knew, invited scrutiny as readily as envy. That afternoon, while she reviewed seating plans for an upcoming gathering, Violet became aware of Edwin watching from the far end of the room. She kept her focus on the page, though warmth crept beneath her calm. The rose of her gown felt suddenly conspicuous. When she finished, she looked up, and their gazes held without apology. No words passed. None were needed. The exchange carried acknowledgement rather than claim, awareness without demand. Violet felt the balance between them shift, not toward possession, but toward something steadier and more dangerous, shared recognition. Later, alone in her chamber, Violet removed the pins from her hair, letting it loosen briefly before arranging it again for the evening. She studied her reflection with unfamiliar scrutiny. She did not look transformed. She looked the same woman she had always been, only now standing where light reached her more fully. The realization unsettled her more than exclusion ever had. Across the house, Edwin stood at his window, the city darkening beyond the glass, understanding that his quiet advocacy had altered the terms of engagement. He was no longer merely observing Violet Renbury. He was choosing, again and again, to stand where she stood, and that choice was beginning to define him. The evening gathering was modest by design, intended to display refinement without spectacle, yet Violet felt its weight the moment she entered the room. Candlelight softened the edges of furniture and faces alike, lending warmth that did nothing to dull scrutiny. She wore a warm apricot evening gown, the color chosen after long consideration, rich enough to acknowledge the occasion without daring excess. Her hair was styled with care, soft curls pinned low at her neck, controlled yet not severe. As she crossed the threshold, conversation shifted by degrees too small to call abrupt, but unmistakable all the same. Her place had been set nearer the center than before, not beside Edwin but no longer at the margins. The change was measured, a compromise offered by custom rather than granted by conviction. Violet accepted it with composed grace, folding her hands and allowing herself neither hope nor disappointment. She reminded herself that proximity was not belonging, that attention could be provisional. Yet as the room filled, she felt the gaze of others return to her again and again, assessing, recalculating, attempting to determine the terms of her presence. Edwin remained alert without appearing watchful. He stood with a small group near the mantel, his posture relaxed, his attention ostensibly divided, though nothing escaped him. He noted the way Violet was addressed indirectly, the compliments that circled without landing, the faint pauses that suggested uncertainty about how much respect she was now owed. When a remark edged toward reduction, suggesting her position was temporary, Edwin's focus sharpened. He turned his head, met the speaker's eyes, and responded with calm authority, redirecting the conversation without rebuke. The effect was immediate, the implication withered, the room adjusted. Violet felt the intervention as a release of tension she had not allowed herself to acknowledge. She did not look toward Edwin at once. She held her composure, accepting the moment as though it were expected rather than defended. Yet when she finally met his gaze across the room, the connection felt charged, precise. Gratitude flickered, followed by something more unsettling: trust. Trust required surrender of vigilance, and vigilance had long been her refuge. As the evening progressed, conversation resumed with cautious warmth. Violet found herself drawn into a discussion of books and travel, her opinions received with interest rather than indulgence. The apricot of her gown caught the candlelight, lending her a presence she could not deny. Still, she remained aware that this acceptance rested on a fragile foundation, one sustained by Edwin's continued regard. The knowledge both comforted and unsettled her. When the gathering concluded, Violet withdrew with practiced restraint, her expression serene. Edwin watched her departure, understanding that each moment of public alignment carried consequence. He had stepped further into visibility with her, and the room had followed his lead. The scrutiny had not lessened, it had sharpened. Yet as Violet passed from sight, Edwin recognized that the risk now felt necessary. Whatever was unfolding between them had moved beyond curiosity. It had entered the realm of shared exposure, where retreat would no longer be possible for either of them. The quiet that followed the gathering settled over Violet like a held breath. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of her chamber, pale and restrained, illuminating the careful order she maintained around her. She dressed slowly in a cream and sage walking gown, the colors chosen for calm rather than concealment, and arranged her hair into a neat Regency coil that left her face unobscured. The woman reflected in the glass appeared composed, untroubled. Violet knew better. Proximity had altered expectation, and expectation was dangerous. She replayed the evening in careful fragments, the recalculated seating, the measured courtesy, the moment Edwin intervened without spectacle. Gratitude had stirred, followed by unease. Protection, she had learned, always came with a price, even when offered with restraint. She feared becoming a symbol rather than a person, an exception permitted only while it served another's authority. The thought settled heavily. Violet resolved that if her presence required constant defense, she would not remain to be defended. Dignity mattered more than comfort. Throughout the morning, she adjusted her movements accordingly. She declined an invitation to join a small gathering in the morning room, citing correspondence that required attention. She limited her conversation to what was necessary, choosing usefulness over visibility. The staff noticed. So did Edwin. From the far end of the library, he observed the subtle retreat, the way Violet narrowed herself once more, as though attempting to undo what had already been seen. The shift unsettled him more than resistance ever could. Withdrawal suggested not defiance, but preparation. Edwin understood then that his silence was no longer neutral. It had become a risk. He approached Violet later that afternoon with deliberate intent, not to reassure, but to include. He invited her opinion on arrangements for an upcoming dinner, phrasing the request as expectation rather than courtesy. Violet answered with clarity, her voice steady, though surprise flickered briefly across her expression. Edwin accepted her suggestions without amendment. The exchange was brief, unremarkable to any observer, yet it carried weight. It signaled intention rather than impulse. Emotionally, Violet felt the ground shift beneath her resolve. Inclusion, when offered consistently, eroded the certainty of departure she had been constructing. She was unsettled by the realization that Edwin's actions were not isolated gestures, but an emerging pattern. Patterns invited trust. Trust required risk. That evening, as she prepared for dinner, choosing a soft pale gold gown and arranging her hair with quiet precision, Violet acknowledged the conflict within her. Leaving would preserve safety. Staying would demand courage. Across the house, Edwin stood alone in his study, considering the same tension from another angle. He recognized that keeping Violet near without clarity would eventually wound her, and that authority alone could not secure what he had begun to value. The decision he faced was not whether to continue disrupting custom, but whether to do so with purpose rather than instinct. As dusk settled over London, both understood, without speaking it aloud, that the moment for cautious observation was ending. What followed would require choice, openly made, and neither could yet predict the cost. Attention, once granted, did not recede politely. It lingered, pressed close, reshaping the air Violet moved through. She felt it in the way invitations were now extended with careful emphasis, as though each carried a silent question about how she ought to respond. That morning she dressed in a soft lilac day gown, the color chosen for gentleness rather than display, and arranged her hair into a smooth, understated knot that revealed her face without inviting inspection. She told herself the choices were practical. In truth, they were defensive. Visibility demanded precision. The drawing room filled gradually, conversation knitting itself together in strands that included Violet, just often enough to be undeniable. Compliments came edged with curiosity, inquiries framed to sound kind while probing for limits. Violet answered with composed brevity, never offering more than was requested, never shrinking from what was properly hers to give. She had learned long ago that warmth could be mistaken for permission. Still, the strain of constant awareness wore at her. She wondered how long interest could be sustained before it curdled into resentment, how quickly attention might be withdrawn once novelty faded. Edwin watched these exchanges with a growing sense of unease. He recognized the tone immediately. It was the same careful civility used to test boundaries without violating them, to measure how far an exception might extend before it must be corrected. He had endured such scrutiny himself when younger, when his authority was not yet settled, and the memory sharpened his perception. Violet was being weighed, not welcomed. The realization stirred a protective instinct he had not anticipated, one that carried less satisfaction than responsibility. When Edwin joined the group, the atmosphere shifted at once. Conversation smoothed, edges blunted by his presence. Violet felt the change keenly and disliked the relief it brought. Dependence, she knew, was its own vulnerability. As the gathering dispersed, she found herself alone with Edwin near the tall windows overlooking the street. He asked after her comfort, the inquiry quiet and sincere. Violet answered truthfully but cautiously, expressing gratitude without claim. The restraint in her voice struck him more deeply than complaint would have. That afternoon, Violet retreated to her chamber earlier than usual. She removed the lilac gown with deliberate care, as though shedding something heavier than fabric, and sat for a long moment in stillness. Being seen had begun to feel like standing beneath a lamp that could not be dimmed. She feared becoming a passing fascination, valued only for the disruption she represented rather than for herself. The thought carried a familiar ache. Edwin, meanwhile, confronted an uncomfortable truth. His regard, however consistent, was not enough if it remained undefined. Attention without clarity invited misunderstanding, and misunderstanding could wound more deeply than neglect. He recognized that Violet's composure masked a growing doubt, one he had helped create by changing her circumstances without naming his intent. As evening approached, he understood that the space between them could no longer be bridged by gesture alone. What had begun as correction now demanded honesty, and honesty would require him to risk more than authority. Expectation arrived without warning, spoken aloud at last rather than implied. Edwin encountered it in the late morning, delivered with practiced calm by those who believed they spoke reason itself. The conversation unfolded in his uncle's sitting room, sunlight catching on polished wood and heavy drapery, the setting chosen to soften what was, at its core, a negotiation. Marriage was raised not as question but as conclusion, a matter of timing rather than inclination. Names were mentioned with measured approval, fortunes assessed with quiet satisfaction. Edwin listened, dressed in a dark green day coat that matched his composure, his expression revealing nothing. Inside, resistance tightened into clarity. He had expected this moment. He had simply not expected how intolerable it would feel now. Each proposed alliance sounded hollow, stripped of meaning by comparison he had not invited but could no longer avoid. Violet's presence rose unbidden in his mind, not as contrast in beauty or advantage, but as measure of truth. None of the women discussed were imagined as partners in silence, as companions in endurance. They were suitable. Violet was singular. The distinction mattered more than he had known it could. Edwin did not refuse outright. He did not yet declare defiance. He asked for time, his voice even, his reasoning framed in duty rather than reluctance. The request was granted with indulgent patience, as though postponement were concession enough. When he left the room, the decision pressed against him with sudden weight. Silence, he understood, would soon be interpreted as consent. Violet learned of the discussion indirectly, the knowledge arriving through careful phrasing meant to appear harmless. A remark about the Duke's future, an observation about the necessity of alliances, delivered with a smile that invited agreement rather than inquiry. She wore a pale blue morning gown that day, her hair arranged with deliberate neatness, and she felt the words settle like a verdict. There was no accusation in them, no cruelty. That was what made them effective. They framed her presence as temporary without ever naming her. Emotionally, Violet did not react at once. She had learned the discipline of stillness too well. Instead, she absorbed the implication and turned inward, weighing it with familiar precision. If expectation was closing in on Edwin, then her place beside him, however altered, was always provisional. She would not be measured against advantage. She would not wait to be displaced. The resolve formed quietly, without bitterness, and settled into her bones. That afternoon, Edwin noticed a change he could not immediately name. Violet's manner remained composed, her courtesy intact, yet something essential had withdrawn. She answered when addressed, fulfilled every expectation placed upon her, but the ease he had glimpsed in her was gone. The absence unsettled him more than conflict would have. He sensed that the future being planned around him was already casting its shadow across her, and for the first time, he understood that delay was not neutrality. It was harm. By evening, both stood on opposite sides of the same realization. Expectation had spoken. Silence would answer it unless one of them chose otherwise. The knowledge settled slowly, like dust after a door had been closed. Violet did not hear her fate spoken directly, and perhaps that was the cruelty of it. It arrived through careful voices and softened language, through remarks shaped to sound benevolent rather than decisive. She was standing near the window, in the smaller morning room, when the conversation drifted just close enough to reach her, her presence assumed, but not acknowledged. A comment about propriety, a reminder that circumstances change, a gentle suggestion that extended stays often become inconvenient, even when gratitude is sincere. No one looked at her. No one needed to. She remained still, her hands folded loosely at her waist, her expression composed. She wore a muted, pale blue gown that day, chosen for restraint, the fabric plain and unassuming, her hair arranged in a neat coil that allowed no stray softness. Years of careful living had taught her how to receive such information without visible reaction. She thanked the speaker when the remark was turned toward her at last, inclined her head, and excused herself with impeccable courtesy. Only when she reached the quiet of the corridor did the weight of it press fully against her chest. It was not rejection that wounded her. It was inevitability. The sense that no matter how carefully she conducted herself, no matter how useful or unobtrusive she remained, her place would always be conditional. She had been allowed nearer the light, but never promised warmth. Violet understood then that waiting would not preserve dignity. Staying without certainty would erode it. That afternoon, she began to prepare. Not hurriedly, not with drama, but with the same methodical calm that had carried her through every previous transition. She sorted her belongings, separating what must remain from what could accompany her elsewhere. There was little enough to choose from. Each item folded away felt like a quiet acknowledgement that the world had not altered as much as it had seemed. She wore a simple ivory gown while she worked, her hair pinned back for practicality, and allowed herself no indulgence of grief beyond a tightening of breath now and then. Edwin sensed the change before he understood its cause. Violet's presence remained correct, her manner unflawed, yet the subtle warmth he had begun to recognize in her had vanished. She no longer lingered after conversations. She no longer met his gaze unless addressed. The shift unsettled him deeply. He recognized withdrawal when he saw it. It was the posture of someone preparing to leave without protest. When he encountered her in the late afternoon, their exchange was brief and careful. Violet answered his questions with precision, her tone respectful, her eyes steady but distant. Edwin watched her walk away with an unease he could not yet name. He did not know what she had heard, only that something decisive had reached her, and for the first time he felt the sharp edge of what his silence had allowed to form. Distance announced itself in Violet's restraint. She did nothing overt to signal it, nothing that could be named or corrected, yet the space between herself and the household widened with quiet precision. She no longer positioned herself where conversation might naturally include her. She fulfilled requests efficiently, declined invitations politely, and moved through rooms as though already half absent. That morning she dressed in a subdued dove cream day gown, simple in line and free of ornament, her hair arranged into a smooth, practical coil that suggested intention rather than fatigue. It was the attire of someone preparing for departure, though no bags yet stood ready. Edwin sensed the shift immediately. He felt it in the altered rhythm of the house, in the way Violet's presence no longer registered as potential interruption, but as something already accounted for, already diminishing. He encountered her less often, and when he did, their exchanges were stripped of the subtle ease that had begun to form. She answered him with perfect courtesy, her tone unassailable, yet her gaze no longer lingered. The change unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. Withdrawal suggested finality, and finality demanded response. He attempted to understand without forcing confrontation. He reviewed the recent days with careful attention, searching for the moment where he might have misstepped. The proposed match returned to him with unwelcome clarity. He had allowed discussion of his future to proceed without resistance, believing time itself might solve what hesitation had postponed. Now he understood that his silence had spoken for him. It had told Violet that her place remained provisional, dependent on his indecision rather than secured by choice. Violet, for her part, had already made peace with her decision. She moved through the day with a steadiness born of acceptance, allowing herself no indulgence of hope. Her belongings remained in their places for now, but she had begun the quiet work of emotional departure, detaching with the same care she once applied to survival. She reminded herself that dignity lay not in being chosen, but in choosing herself when uncertainty threatened to hollow her. Edwin encountered her in the late afternoon near the staircase, sunlight slanting across the marble floor between them. He paused, as though intending to speak, then hesitated. The moment passed. Violet inclined her head and continued on her way, leaving behind the faint impression of a door closing without sound. The restraint in her movement struck him with sudden force. She was not waiting to be asked to stay. She was preparing to leave without requiring explanation. That realization unsettled him deeply. Edwin stood where she had passed, aware that authority could summon her, could command her presence, yet understanding that such power would only deepen the wound forming between them. For the first time, he grasped that correction was no longer enough. What stood before him was not a matter of household order, but of choice delayed too long. If he did nothing, the distance would complete itself, quietly and irreversibly, and the responsibility for that loss would be his alone. Violet began to prepare for departure with the same care she had always applied to endurance. There was no dramatic resolve, no moment of decision marked by tears or anger. It arrived instead as certainty, quiet and unyielding. She rose early, before the house stirred fully, and dressed in a modest cream morning gown, unadorned and practical, its simplicity intentional. Her hair was smoothed into a neat Regency coil, pinned firmly, leaving nothing loose that might betray hesitation. If she was to leave, she would do so without spectacle, without allowing emotion to fray the dignity she had guarded for so long. She started with her belongings, few enough to gather without assistance. Each folded garment felt like an acknowledgement rather than a loss. She selected what could travel easily and set aside what must remain, items never truly hers despite their familiarity. The room grew barer by degrees, though nothing yet appeared altered to a casual eye. Violet worked steadily, pausing only once to rest her hands against the back of a chair when breath tightened unexpectedly. She allowed herself that single moment, then continued, because delay would invite doubt, and doubt would undo her resolve. Throughout the morning, she conducted herself as she always had. She answered requests, completed tasks, and offered courtesy where expected. No one questioned her. That, too, felt telling. She realized how easily her absence would be absorbed, how little disruption her leaving might cause once the initial curiosity faded. The thought did not wound her as deeply as it once might have. It clarified. She had never belonged to this house by right. Proximity had not altered that truth. Edwin encountered the evidence of her intention by accident. Passing near her chamber, he noticed the door standing ajar, the room within unnaturally precise. A trunk lay open upon the bed, its contents arranged with care rather than haste. The sight struck him with sudden force. This was not a threat. It was not leverage. It was conclusion. Violet was not waiting to be stopped. She was preparing to be gone. He stood in the corridor longer than necessary, the weight of the moment settling heavily. Authority rose instinctively to hand, offering solutions he recognized as hollow. He could command her to remain. He could delay her departure through obligation. Yet even as the thoughts formed, he understood the cost. To keep her by power would be to lose her entirely, to confirm every doubt that had driven her to this point. For the first time, restraint did not feel like discipline. It felt like cowardice. Violet closed the trunk quietly and straightened. She smoothed the sleeves of her gown, composed her expression, and prepared to re-enter the house as though nothing had changed. She would leave without reproach, without demand. If she was remembered at all, she would be remembered as she had lived there, with restraint, with gratitude, and with her dignity intact. What she did not know was that the silence she had chosen had finally forced Edwin Kingswell to confront the cost of his own. Edwin did not seek Violet at once. He stood instead in the corridor. The open trunk burned into his thoughts, forcing him to confront the shape of what he had almost allowed to pass without resistance. The house moved around him, servants gliding past with quiet efficiency, the day unfolding as it always did, indifferent to private reckonings. Yet nothing in him felt settled. Authority, so often his refuge, offered no answer that did not feel like theft. To command her to remain would preserve order and destroy trust in the same breath. He understood that now with unwelcome clarity. When he finally found her, she was in one of the smaller sitting rooms, sorting correspondence with calm precision. Violet wore a soft dove ivory gown, simple and unassuming, her hair arranged into a smooth, practical coil that spoke of intention rather than ornament. She looked up at his entrance with composed courtesy, no surprise flickering across her expression. That, more than the packed trunk, confirmed what she had decided. She had already stepped beyond hope. "I am told you intend to leave," Edwin said, his tone measured, stripped of command. He chose the words carefully, aware that how he spoke now would shape whatever followed. Violet met his gaze without flinching. She did not deny it. She explained instead, calmly, that circumstances shifted, that gratitude must not overstay its welcome, that she would not remain where her presence required justification. Her voice did not waver. Each sentence landed with quiet finality. Edwin felt the weight of her restraint keenly. He countered not with feeling, but with reason, insisting that her departure was unnecessary, that arrangements could be made, that no one wished her gone. Even as he spoke, he recognized the insufficiency of his argument. Violet listened with courtesy, and then replied with gentle firmness. She would not be persuaded by convenience. She had lived too long at the mercy of circumstance to mistake tolerance for belonging. The room held their silence. Outside, the distant sounds of the city filtered faintly through the windows, a reminder that life continued regardless of private turning points. Edwin understood then that the moment demanded more than reassurance. It demanded exposure. He admitted, at last, that her leaving unsettled him, that the thought of the house without her presence felt like a loss he could not justify ignoring. He did not name affection. He named consequence. Violet absorbed the words carefully. Hope stirred despite her resolve, unwelcome and dangerous. She steadied herself against it, reminding herself that uncertainty had wounded her before. She asked, quietly, whether his concern arose from habit or from choice. The question hung between them, precise and unavoidable. Edwin did not answer at once. He felt the instinct to retreat behind authority, behind caution, and rejected it. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new gravity. He told her she was not dismissed, not tolerated, not temporary. He told her she mattered. It was not a declaration of love. It was something more difficult, acknowledgement without protection. Violet felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. For the first time, staying did not feel like surrender. It felt like risk. The words Edwin had spoken did not resolve anything. They unsettled it. Violet felt that truth immediately, the way still water ripples long after a stone has sunk. She did not move from her chair. She did not soften her posture. She held herself as she always had when something precious threatened to become precarious. Hope, once stirred, was far more dangerous than disappointment. "You say I matter," she replied at last, her voice even, carefully composed. "Yet I am asked to trust that meaning without knowing its shape." Her hands rested folded upon the papers before her, betraying nothing of the tension coiled beneath her calm. I have lived too long on implication, Your Grace. It has always required more of me than it ever returned. Edwin listened without interruption, though every instinct urged him to explain, to persuade, to command clarity into place. He resisted them all. He understood that the moment demanded restraint of a different kind. Violet continued, speaking not in accusation but in truth. She told him what it was to remain where one's place must be defended, to be included by favor rather than by right, to wait while futures were discussed in rooms one was never meant to enter. Each word was measured, her dignity intact, yet the cumulative weight pressed hard against his chest. I will not stay, she said quietly, if staying means existing at the edge of your decisions. The honesty struck deeper than anger could have. Edwin recognized the justice in her refusal. He had altered her circumstances without anchoring them, had drawn her into visibility without offering certainty. He spoke then of duty, of expectation, of the narrowness of the path he had been taught never to leave. His tone remained controlled, but something in it had shifted. For the first time, he allowed her to see the cost of his discipline. He admitted that choice had always terrified him more than obligation, because obligation required nothing of the heart. Violet regarded him steadily. She did not step toward him. She did not retreat. Then you must decide, she said simply, not whether I remain, but whether I am chosen. Silence followed, heavy and exacting. Edwin felt the weight of his title, his authority, the future others had already drafted on his behalf. For years, he had allowed such things to stand in for decision. Now they felt insufficient, even obstructive. He realized that withholding clarity had been a way of protecting himself, not her. The truth was uncomfortable and unavoidable. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier. He told her he could not ask her to remain on uncertainty. He told her that whatever he offered next would be deliberate, not provisional. He did not yet name it. He did not yet claim it. But the intention was unmistakable. Violet rose then, smoothing the front of her gown with habitual precision. She inclined her head, acknowledging not victory but honesty. I will give you time, she said, but not silence. And with that, she left the room, carrying with her the certainty that whatever followed would be shaped by choice at last, not endurance. Edwin remained where Violet had left him, the quiet of the room settling with unfamiliar weight. Her words echoed with unsettling clarity, not as challenge but as boundary. He had spent his life mastering the art of restraint, believing it synonymous with honor, yet now he saw it for what it had often been, avoidance disguised as discipline. Violet had refused to remain at the edge of his decisions, and in doing so, had placed him squarely at the center of his own. By evening, necessity forced action. A discussion awaited him in the formal parlor, framed as routine, yet sharpened by purpose. Advisors and family members gathered with practiced ease, confident in the inevitability of conclusions long assumed. Edwin entered composed, dressed in a dark charcoal evening coat, his expression revealing nothing. The conversation turned swiftly, as he knew it would, toward arrangements and expectations, toward futures planned without reference to inclination. He listened until the familiar impatience rose, then cut cleanly through it. I will not proceed as suggested, he said calmly. The room stilled. No anger edged his tone, no justification softened the refusal. He stated it as fact. When questions followed, he answered with restraint, asserting that his household required stability grounded in choice rather than convenience. He did not name Violet. He did not need to. The refusal itself was declaration enough. Authority, once used to preserve order, was now wielded to correct it. Word traveled quickly. Violet felt its tremor before it reached her directly, carried through subtle shifts in posture, through glances that sharpened with new calculation. She dressed that evening in a soft lavender gown, the color chosen for composure rather than triumph, her hair arranged with careful precision. She did not assume the decision concerned her, though hope stirred against her will. She waited, because waiting had become necessary again, but it was no longer passive. Edwin sought her out before dinner. He found her in the smaller drawing room, standing near the window, the city lights beginning to glow beyond the glass. He did not preface his words. He told her he had refused what had been proposed. He told her the refusal was not temporary, not strategic. It was chosen. Violet listened without interruption, her expression composed, though her breath caught briefly before settling again. Relief rose, followed immediately by caution. Action mattered. So did motive. I did not refuse for you alone, Edwin continued. I refuse because I will not build a life that excludes what I value. The distinction mattered. Violet understood it at once. His choice was not protection offered from above, but alignment claimed beside her. Emotionally, something shifted within her, cautious hope threading through long-held restraint. Yet she did not surrender it easily. She asked what followed. She asked what place she would hold once consequence arrived. Edwin answered without evasion. He told her she would remain by his decision, not by tolerance. That her presence would no longer require defense, because it would no longer be exceptional. Violet felt the truth of it settle slowly, deliberately. Staying, she realized, would no longer mean waiting to be displaced. It would mean standing where she was seen. For the first time, the choice before her did not feel like survival. It felt like possibility, and possibility demanded courage equal to any endurance she had ever known. Staying altered Violet's inner landscape more than leaving ever could have. The decision settled gradually, not as relief, but as responsibility. She rose the next morning with the same measured calm she had cultivated all her life, yet beneath it ran a new current of awareness. She dressed in a pale rose-day gown, the color neither tentative nor bold, and arranged her hair with deliberate care into a smooth Regency knot that framed her face without ornament. The woman in the mirror looked much as she always had. What had changed was the ground beneath her feet. She was no longer waiting to be moved. Throughout the morning, the house adjusted in subtle ways. Invitations arrived addressed directly to her rather than routed through others. Her opinion was requested on matters of arrangement without explanation or apology. Violet answered with clarity, careful not to overstep, yet refusing to retreat. Each small inclusion carried weight. She felt the strain of attention deepen rather than ease, because staying now required presence rather than endurance. It demanded that she occupy space she had once softened instinctively. Edwin observed the change with equal attentiveness. He noticed how Violet's composure had sharpened, how her stillness now carried intention rather than self-protection. He sensed the tension beneath her calm and understood it too well. Power could open doors, but it could not make the space beyond them safe. That would require trust, and trust could not be commanded. He resisted the impulse to shield her from every consequence of his choice, knowing that protection without agency would only recreate the imbalance she had already rejected. Emotionally, Violet grappled with doubt as insistently as hope. She questioned whether remaining placed her once more at the mercy of another's resolve, whether choice made today could be undone tomorrow. Old habits urged caution. She caught herself measuring glances, reading tone, searching for signs of withdrawal. The vigilance exhausted her, yet she could not relinquish it entirely. Survival had taught her to watch for erosion long before collapse. In the afternoon, Edwin joined her briefly in the library. He spoke not of decisions or consequence, but of ordinary matters, allowing normalcy to assert itself between them. The restraint was deliberate. Violet recognized the effort and felt gratitude sharpen into something more complex. Partnership, she realized, was not forged through grand gestures alone, but through the discipline of consistency. Edwin's presence beside her, unremarkable yet steadfast, offered reassurance more sustaining than any declaration. By evening, Violet stood alone at the window of her chamber, watching the city settle into dusk. She acknowledged the fear that lingered, the risk she had accepted by staying. Yet beneath it, a steadier truth emerged. She had chosen not to disappear quietly. She had chosen to be seen, to remain, to claim space without apology. Whatever followed would test that choice, but it would not erase it. Downstairs, Edwin prepared for the next public reckoning with calm resolve. He understood now that authority had brought Violet to this point, but only constancy would keep her there. The path ahead promised difficulty rather than ease. Yet for the first time, both stood within it knowingly, not as protector and protected, but as two people learning how to stand together without surrendering themselves. The test arrived sooner than Violet expected, announced not with ceremony but with intention thinly veiled as civility. The gathering was larger than usual, the guest list carefully assembled to observe rather than celebrate. Violet recognized the purpose the moment she stepped into the room. She dressed with care in a warm blush-toned evening gown, the color chosen for steadiness rather than display, and arranged her hair in soft curls pinned low at her neck, elegant but restrained. She did not mistake the attention for welcome. It was scrutiny sharpened by curiosity, and she felt its weight settle immediately. Conversation gathered around her in deliberate arcs. Questions were framed politely yet carried edge, inquiries about her comfort, her plans, her gratitude. Violet answered with composure, refusing both deflection and excess. She would not perform humility for approval, nor would she claim a position not yet secured by time. Each response was measured, precise. She felt Edwin's presence nearby, not hovering, not distant, simply present, and that constancy steadied her more than any reassurance could have. The remark came midway through the evening, delivered with practiced smoothness by someone who believed themselves beyond reproach. It suggested, lightly, that Violet's situation was temporary, a convenience afforded by indulgence rather than intent. The words were chosen carefully, designed to provoke without overt challenge. For a heartbeat, silence hovered. Violet felt the familiar instinct to withdraw, to soften, to endure. She resisted it. She lifted her chin, her expression calm, and met the speaker's gaze without apology. Before she could reply, Edwin spoke. His voice carried easily, controlled, and unyielding. He corrected the implication with precision, stating Violet's place without embellishment or defense. He did not argue. He did not explain. He aligned himself with her openly, allowing no room for reinterpretation. The effect was immediate. The room adjusted, recalibrating around the certainty of his stance. The challenge withered under exposure, its intent laid bare. Emotionally, Violet experienced a surge not of triumph, but of clarity. This was not protection offered conditionally. This was choice made visible. Relief followed, then something steadier, trust. Not blind, not naive, but grounded in action repeated rather than promised. She remained composed, accepting the moment without performance, and the evening resumed under altered terms. Later, as the gathering thinned, Violet felt the strain settle into fatigue. Being seen demanded energy she was still learning to expend. Edwin noticed and did not insist she remain longer than necessary. When they spoke privately, their exchange was brief and unremarkable, yet it carried weight. He asked if she wished to leave. She said she did. He escorted her without comment, without spectacle. Alone again, Violet allowed herself a measured breath. The test had come, and it had been met not by endurance alone, but by alignment. Whatever followed would not be simple. Resistance would persist. Yet for the first time, she understood that standing beside Edwin did not require diminishing herself. The chair drawn out for her had become more than gesture. It had become ground, and she stood upon it with her dignity intact. The days that followed unfolded with deliberate recalibration. Nothing was announced, nothing proclaimed, yet the household adjusted as though responding to a shift in gravity. Violet felt it in the smallest exchanges, a question directed to her without preface, a decision delayed until her opinion was heard, an invitation extended as expectation rather than courtesy. She dressed that morning in a soft celadon green gown, the color chosen for clarity and quiet confidence, and arranged her hair in a smooth classical knot that reflected composure rather than caution. She did not mistake the changes for ease. They were acknowledgments, and acknowledgment carried its own burden. For the first time, Violet found herself navigating presence rather than absence. Being overlooked had required endurance. Being included demanded discernment. She measured her words carefully, aware that every contribution was now weighed not for novelty but for legitimacy. The strain was subtle but constant. She refused the temptation to soften her views to ensure acceptance, just as she refused the urge to retreat into silence. Instead, she spoke when necessary, with calm precision, and allowed her restraint to carry authority rather than apology. Edwin watched the transition with attentive restraint. He had altered the structure of his household deliberately, not to elevate Violet as exception, but to remove the mechanisms that had rendered her marginal. Authority, he understood, was most effective when it reshaped systems rather than spotlighted individuals. He did not shield her from consequence, nor did he abandon her to it. He remained present, consistent, allowing the shift to settle through repetition rather than insistence. Emotionally, Violet felt the unfamiliar weight of being taken seriously. It unsettled her more than disregard ever had. She questioned herself constantly, searching for misstep, gauging tone, anticipating resistance. Yet beneath the vigilance, something steadier began to take root. She was no longer borrowing space. She was occupying it. The distinction mattered. It demanded courage of a different sort, one that did not rely on endurance alone. A minor dispute arose over arrangements for an upcoming dinner, trivial in appearance, yet revealing in nature. Violet offered a solution that diverged from tradition, her suggestion grounded in practicality rather than challenge. The room paused. Edwin accepted her proposal without amendment. The matter settled. Violet felt the moment land with quiet force. Her voice had not been tolerated. It had been trusted. Later that afternoon, she walked briefly in the garden, the air cool and clear. She removed her gloves and let her hands rest against the stone balustrade, grounding herself in the reality of the day. For the first time, the thought of remaining did not feel like waiting. It felt like participation. The fear of displacement had not vanished, but it no longer governed her movements. Edwin joined her there without comment. They stood side by side, neither speaking, the city murmuring beyond the walls. In the silence, Violet understood that what was forming between them was not rescue, nor indulgence, nor defiance alone. It was partnership, slow and exacting, forged not through spectacle but through choice repeated until it became truth. Visibility altered Violet in ways she had not anticipated. It was not confidence that came first, but awareness, of posture, of tone, of the way her presence now shaped the room rather than dissolving into it. She dressed that morning in a warm primrose yellow gown, the color brighter than she once would have chosen, its simplicity offset by careful tailoring. Her hair was arranged in a smooth Regency style, gathered low with soft tendrils framing her face, and when she caught her reflection, she did not look bolder. She looked steadier. The difference mattered. The household continued its quiet adjustment. Violet's opinions were no longer curiosities but considerations. She was asked, listened to, and, most unsettling of all, expected to remain consistent. Endurance had once required nothing beyond silence. Consistency demanded conviction. She found herself weighing decisions not for how little space they took, but for how honestly they reflected her judgment. The shift was exhausting, yet it carried a strange satisfaction she did not trust at once. Edwin observed these changes with measured attention. He noticed how Violet's voice no longer softened reflexively, how her gaze held when addressed, how her stillness carried authority rather than deference. The evolution stirred something like pride, tempered by concern. Visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny could wound. He resisted the impulse to intervene preemptively, understanding that overprotection would undo the very balance they were building. Choice, once made, had to be honored with space. Emotionally, Violet began to feel the emergence of self-worth unanchored from approval. It unsettled her. She had learned to define value through usefulness and restraint. Now she faced the unfamiliar task of defining it through presence alone. Doubt surfaced often, whispering that elevation was temporary, that attention would fade or turn. She acknowledged the fear without allowing it command. Courage, she discovered, was not the absence of vigilance, but the refusal to let it dictate retreat. An afternoon conversation in the drawing room tested this new ground. Violet was drawn into discussion about an upcoming visit, her perspective requested openly. She offered her view without apology, her tone calm, her reasoning clear. The room paused, then accepted it. No correction followed. No indulgent smile softened the moment. The acceptance was unremarkable, and therefore profound. Violet felt the weight of it settle slowly, like something earned rather than granted. Later, she allowed herself a moment alone, removing her gloves and resting her hands against the cool surface of the table. The primrose of her gown caught the light, and she did not step back from it. For the first time, she allowed herself to occupy brightness without flinching. Edwin encountered her shortly after, their exchange brief and ordinary. Yet in the simplicity of it, Violet understood something essential. Attraction had deepened, yes, but more than that, regard had matured. What bound them now was not disruption or defiance, but recognition. The danger remained. So did the cost. But beneath both, a steadier truth was forming. Violet Renbury was no longer becoming visible. She was already seen, and she was learning how to stand within that sight without surrendering herself. The past emerged not through confession but through context, revealed in fragments that Edwin offered without ceremony. They were seated in the smaller drawing room as dusk gathered beyond the windows, the hour chosen for quiet rather than intimacy. Violet wore a pale rose gown, softened by the fading light, her hair arranged simply, without ornament. She listened without prompting, sensing that what he shared mattered not for its drama, but for its restraint. Edwin spoke of an earlier attachment shaped by expectation rather than inclination, a connection encouraged for its suitability and endured for its inevitability. He described the discipline with which he had performed affection, the relief he felt when it ended, and the disappointment that followed when he realized how little of himself he had been permitted to bring to it. There was no bitterness in his tone, only precision. He had learned early how to meet obligation without surrendering authority, and in doing so, he had mistaken endurance for fulfillment. The lesson had settled deeply, shaping his caution in ways he had not fully examined until now. Violet absorbed the truth with measured attention. She did not compare herself. She did not seek reassurance. She recognized the familiar shape of a life narrowed by propriety, of choice deferred until it no longer felt possible. Empathy stirred, not as sympathy, but as recognition. She understood the cost of living at a remove from one's own desires. She had paid it herself for years. Emotionally, the exchange shifted something subtle between them. Edwin was no longer the sole arbiter of protection, nor Violet the quiet beneficiary of it. Vulnerability had altered the balance. He had trusted her with something unguarded, and she felt the weight of that trust keenly. The room held their silence without strain, the pause between words as meaningful as the words themselves. Violet responded with care, acknowledging the truth without probing its wounds. She spoke instead of the dangers of safety mistaken for purpose, of how habit can masquerade as honor until it hollows what it preserves. Her voice remained calm, her posture steady, yet conviction threaded her words. Edwin listened, surprised by the clarity she brought to a past he had long accepted as settled. The exchange felt neither confessional nor strategic. It felt necessary. As evening deepened, the conversation drifted to quieter ground. No declarations followed. None were required. The intimacy lay in what had been offered and received without demand. Violet felt a cautious warmth take hold, tempered by awareness of the cost such closeness would invite. Edwin, in turn, recognized that sharing his past had not weakened his position, it had refined it. When they parted, the house felt altered once more, though nothing visible had changed. Violet returned to her chamber with a steadiness she had not known before, understanding that trust was not granted all at once, but built through moments of unguarded truth. Edwin remained in the drawing room, the city's lights blinking on beyond the glass, aware that what he had begun with Violet was no longer defined by defiance alone. It was shaped now by honesty, and honesty would demand constancy in the days to come. The evening settled into quiet that felt almost deliberate, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Violet sensed the shift before it reached language, the way conversation slowed, the way the air seemed to thicken with things unsaid. She dressed for dinner in a soft ivory gown, the fabric warmed by a faint blush sash at the waist, chosen with care for its balance between simplicity and presence. Her hair was arranged with particular attention, smooth at the crown and gathered low, with a few restrained curls framing her face. The preparation felt heavier than usual, not with expectation, but with awareness. Dinner unfolded with measured normality. Words were exchanged, courses served, propriety observed, yet beneath the ritual, tension gathered. Violet felt it whenever Edwin's gaze lingered a fraction longer than courtesy required, whenever silence stretched between remarks that might otherwise have filled it. She remained composed, answering when addressed, her tone calm, though her thoughts pressed close. Something hovered at the edge of articulation, and the nearness of it unsettled her more than absence ever had. Later, when the company dispersed, Violet found herself lingering in the smaller drawing room, the fire reduced to a low glow. Edwin joined her without announcement, his presence steady, unhurried. They spoke at first of inconsequence, of the weather, of the arrangements for the coming week, yet the conversation strained against its own restraint. Violet felt the pull of honesty rise within her, tempered by caution, learned through years of self-protection. She understood now that clarity would demand vulnerability, and vulnerability carried risk she had only just begun to accept. Edwin felt it too. He sensed the moment approaching when discipline would no longer suffice, when silence would become evasion rather than care. His instinct was to wait, to allow certainty to solidify before speech, yet the distance between them felt suddenly intolerable. He began to speak, his voice lower, less measured, words forming that edge toward truth rather than intention. The interruption came without warning. A servant entered to announce a matter requiring immediate attention, the tone apologetic but insistent, the moment fractured. Violet felt the sharp snap of it, the way possibility dissolved back into propriety. She inclined her head automatically, stepping aside, retreating into the familiar safety of form. Edwin answered the interruption with controlled acknowledgement, frustration flickering only briefly before being mastered. When the servant withdrew, the space between them felt altered, the intimacy momentarily broken. Neither attempted to reclaim it. Violet understood the wisdom of restraint even as disappointment tightened her chest. Some truths could not be retrieved once interrupted. They required deliberate return. Edwin watched her closely, recognizing the cost of delay. The near confession had revealed the urgency he had resisted. Silence no longer felt protective. It felt dangerous. Yet he did not press her then. He allowed the interruption to stand, understanding that forcing the moment would cheapen it. Violet excused herself soon after, her manner unassailable, though her thoughts churned beneath the calm. In her chamber, she unpinned her hair slowly, allowing it to loosen before arranging it again for sleep. She acknowledged the frustration, the longing, the fear. Whatever lay between her and Edwin could no longer remain unnamed without consequence. Downstairs, Edwin stood alone by the dying fire, aware that what had nearly been spoken would not be forgotten. The interruption had not erased it. It had only postponed what was becoming inevitable. The pressure returned the following day, with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Violet sensed it before she was directly touched by it, in the way the household's tone shifted from cautious neutrality to anticipatory arrangement. Conversations lowered when she entered rooms. Invitations were extended and withdrawn in the same breath. She dressed that morning in a subdued pale blue gown, the color chosen for restraint rather than concealment, and arranged her hair with deliberate neatness, smoothing every strand into place. She recognized the signs. Decision was being discussed elsewhere, and she was not meant to influence it. The confirmation arrived indirectly, as such things often did. A remark delivered kindly, framed as observation rather than information, suggesting that the Duke's future would soon be secured in a manner befitting his position. No name was offered, none was required. The implication carried enough weight on its own. Violet received it with composed courtesy, her expression betraying nothing. Years of survival had taught her how to absorb such moments without fracture. Yet inside, something settled with quiet finality. She did not rage. She did not grieve aloud. Instead, she reached for the one certainty she trusted: self-respect. Competing for position had never served her. She would not become an alternative measured against advantage, nor would she wait to be dismissed once arrangements were complete. Dignity, she knew, lay not in being chosen under pressure, but in choosing departure before necessity demanded it. Throughout the day, she withdrew with intention. She declined an invitation to join a luncheon, citing correspondence. She limited her conversation to what was required, offering courtesy without engagement. The pale blue of her gown seemed to recede into the rooms she passed through, and she was grateful for its quiet. Distance, she reminded herself, could still be claimed even when visibility had been imposed. Edwin felt the change as acutely as a physical absence. He heard of the renewed discussions, the assumptions already forming around his future, and recognized the danger too late. What had been postponed was now advancing with confidence. When he encountered Violet in the corridor, their exchange was brief, her tone respectful, her gaze steady yet withdrawn. The space between them felt intentional, shaped by decision rather than hesitation. That evening, Edwin stood alone in his study. The city's glow reflected faintly in the glass. He understood then what was at stake. Silence would be interpreted as consent. Delay would become betrayal. Violet was not waiting for reassurance. She was preparing to remove herself from a future that did not yet include her by right. Across the house, Violet sat at her small escritoire, hands folded, breathing measured. She allowed herself no indulgence of hope. Whatever choice Edwin made now would be his alone. She had already made hers. Violet's withdrawal was not dramatic. It unfolded with quiet resolve, the kind shaped by long habit rather than sudden hurt. She rose early and dressed in a pale stone blue day gown, the color muted and deliberate, its simplicity a shield rather than a signal. Her hair was drawn back into a practical Regency knot, smooth and unadorned, every pin placed with care. She intended to make herself smaller again, not out of submission, but out of self-preservation. If she must leave, she would do so without spectacle, without forcing anyone to acknowledge the loss. She declined invitations with gentle efficiency. She completed what was asked of her without lingering. Conversations no longer tempted her to remain. She moved through the house as though already half removed from it, her presence precise, her courtesy unassailable. The staff adjusted quickly, relief and uncertainty mingling in their glances. Violet noticed and did not resent it. She had learned long ago that disappearance was often easier to accommodate than assertion. Emotionally, she braced herself against regret. Staying had taught her what it was to be seen. Leaving would preserve what that visibility had awakened. She would not risk becoming a concession made too late, nor a kindness extended under pressure. If she was to be chosen, it must be without calculation. Otherwise, she would choose herself, as she had learned to do when the world offered no other certainty. Edwin recognized the pattern with growing urgency. Violet's absence was not abrupt, yet it spread through his awareness like cold. He found himself searching for her without intention, noticing the places she no longer occupied, the silences she left behind. Each refusal, each polite distance, clarified what he had been avoiding. She was not withdrawing to be pursued. She was withdrawing to leave without forcing confrontation. The distinction mattered more than he wished. That afternoon, he encountered her briefly near the library. Their exchange was correct, restrained, almost formal. Violet inclined her head, answered his inquiry, and moved on without pause. The lack of hesitation struck him sharply. She was no longer waiting. She was acting. For the first time, Edwin felt the threat of irrevocable loss, not as possibility, but as approaching fact. He returned to his study unsettled, the familiar refuge offering no relief. Authority pressed close, offering solutions that felt increasingly hollow. He could summon her. He could insist upon explanation. He could delay departure through obligation. Each option promised control at the cost of trust, and trust, he now understood, was the very thing at stake. As evening fell, Violet stood alone by the window of her chamber, the city lights beginning to glow beyond the glass. She acknowledged the ache without indulging it. Leaving would cost her something real, but staying without certainty would cost more. Endurance had carried her far, but it could not build a future. If Edwin chose her now, it must be freely, unmistakably. Otherwise, she would go, carrying with her the knowledge that she had once been seen, and had refused to settle for anything less than choice. The certainty Edwin had avoided finally named itself as fear. It arrived not in a rush, but with deliberate force, settling into him as Violet's absence became patterned rather than incidental. He noticed how often he now expected to see her and did not, how rooms seemed misaligned without her quiet presence anchoring them. This was not curiosity unmet, nor wounded pride. It was the recognition that something essential had begun to recede, and that his own hesitation had allowed it. He dressed that evening in formal black, the severity of it mirroring the clarity forming within him. The proposed alliance was spoken of again, this time with confidence rather than inquiry. Arrangements were referenced as though already agreed, timelines sketched in tones that assumed compliance. Edwin listened, his expression composed, yet each word struck with increasing weight. Silence, he understood now, was being read as assent. His restraint had become permission for others to decide in his stead. Violet did not attend the discussion. Her absence pressed harder than presence ever had. Edwin realized with sudden sharpness that if he allowed the evening to pass without action, he would lose more than her proximity. He would lose the right to claim choice at all. The future being constructed around him would close its doors neatly, efficiently, and Violet Renbury would be excluded without protest, without spectacle, without even the courtesy of explanation. The realization stripped him of patience. Discipline had always served him well, but now it revealed its limit. Control without courage was merely habit, and habit could not protect what mattered. He excused himself from the gathering with restrained formality and crossed the house with purpose he no longer disguised. Violet was in the small sitting room, reading by the window, the light fading toward evening. She wore a simple cream gown, her hair arranged neatly, her posture composed. The sight of her steadiness unsettled him more than reproach ever could have. She looked prepared, not expectant. When she looked up at his entrance, there was no surprise, only polite attention. "I cannot remain silent," Edwin said, the words deliberate, unadorned. He did not preface them with apology or explanation, not without losing what I intend to choose. Violet closed the book carefully, her expression unreadable. She did not speak at once. She waited, granting him the space his words demanded. Edwin continued, his voice steady, acknowledging the fear he had mistaken for caution, the avoidance he addressed as responsibility. He admitted that delay had been easier than decision, and that ease had nearly cost him her. "I will not allow my future to be shaped by habit," he said, "nor will I ask you to remain in uncertainty." Emotion stirred in Violet despite her resolve. She felt it keenly and restrained it with effort. Words, she knew, were necessary but insufficient. She asked him what action followed acknowledgement. The question was precise, unavoidable. Edwin met it without evasion. He told her he would refuse publicly and without qualification what had been assumed on his behalf. He would do so not later, not indirectly, but now. The decision was not impulsive. It was overdue. Violet regarded him steadily, the moment balanced on a fragile edge. For the first time, she did not feel the need to prepare for departure. She did not yet step forward. But she remained, and in that stillness, Edwin understood that courage had finally replaced restraint, and that the choice he had delayed could no longer wait another hour. The refusal was delivered where it could not be softened, delayed, or reframed. Edwin chose the moment deliberately, not for drama but for clarity. The gathering had been arranged to formalize expectation, a setting weighted with approval and assumption. He entered composed, dressed in a dark blue evening coat that signaled authority without excess, and allowed the conversation to reach its intended turn before he spoke. When he did, his voice carried with calm precision, unraised and unmistakable. "I will not proceed," he said simply. Silence followed, sharp and exact. Questions arrived at once, cloaked in reason and concern. Edwin answered each with restraint, refusing explanation that might be negotiated away. He stated that his future would not be determined by convenience, that alliance without choice was no alliance at all. He did not name Violet. He did not need to. The refusal itself declared that something essential had been claimed beyond the reach of arrangement. Authority, long used to preserve order, was now used to dismantle assumption. Word moved quickly, carried not by servants alone but by the sudden recalibration of regard. Violet felt the shift before it reached her directly, the atmosphere altering as though a window had been opened. She wore a muted blush gown that evening, chosen for steadiness rather than triumph, her hair arranged in a simple low chignon that allowed no misreading of intent. She did not assume the decision belonged to her. She waited, because waiting was no longer passive. It was watchful. Edwin sought her out without delay. He found her in the smaller drawing room, standing near the window, the city lights beginning to glow beyond the glass. He did not preface his words. He told her what he had done, not as confession but as fact. Violet listened, her expression composed, her breath measured. Relief stirred, then caution, then something deeper and steadier. Action mattered. It always had. "I refused because I choose," Edwin said, "not because I was pressed." The distinction settled between them. Violet understood it immediately. He had not acted in reaction to loss alone, nor to preserve her presence by force. He had acted to claim his own future, and in doing so, had made space where she could stand without apology. Emotion rose, unwelcome and undeniable. She held it carefully, knowing that trust required more than a single decisive moment. She asked what followed. Edwin answered without hesitation. He told her consequence would arrive swiftly, that resistance would harden, that his choice would be tested. He told her he would not retreat. The steadiness of his tone mattered more than any promise. It signaled resolve, rooted in understanding rather than impulse. Violet felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. For the first time, staying did not feel like waiting for displacement. It felt like standing within a choice already made, yet she did not step toward him. She remained where she was, meeting his gaze with quiet strength. "Then we proceed honestly," she said. "Together, or not at all." Edwin inclined his head in acknowledgement. The refusal had altered the terms of engagement irrevocably. The future ahead promised difficulty rather than ease, scrutiny rather than approval. Yet, as Violet stood before him, steady and unflinching, Edwin understood that defiance made visible was only the beginning. What would sustain them now was not rebellion, but constancy, and he was prepared, at last, to offer it. Violet did not accept Edwin's declaration as resolution. She accepted it as beginning. The distinction mattered, and she held to it with the same care she had once applied to endurance. They met later that evening in the quiet of the smaller sitting room, the fire reduced to embers, the house settled into watchful calm. Violet wore a pearl-toned evening gown, understated and precise, her hair arranged with soft curls pinned low, leaving her face unguarded but composed. She did not sit at once. She remained standing, choosing equality of posture before equality of sentiment. "You have refused," she said, her voice steady. "Now I need to know what that refusal means for me." The words were neither challenge nor plea. They were claim. Violet had learned the cost of implication and would not accept it again. She spoke of what she required. Clarity without protection, choice without containment, a place that did not shrink when scrutiny sharpened. She named the fear that lingered, the fear of being provisional even after defiance had been made public. Her restraint did not soften the truth, it sharpened it. Edwin listened without interruption, his hands loosely clasped, his attention undivided. He felt the justice of her demand and welcomed it. When he spoke, he did not reach for eloquence. He reached for accuracy. He told her that his choice was not a shield offered above her head, but a path he intended to walk beside her. He acknowledged the imbalance that had existed and named his commitment to dismantle it through consistency rather than decree. "I choose you," he said, not as confession, but as statement of intent, not because I am defying others, because I am aligning myself. The words settled slowly. Violet measured them against his actions, against the days already lived, against the cost she knew would follow. Courage rose, not the kind born of desperation, but the kind that accepts risk without surrendering self. She asked one final question, quiet and exacting. "If this costs you ease, will you resent me?" The room held its breath. Edwin answered without hesitation. He told her that ease had never sustained him, that resentment grew from avoidance, not from choice made honestly. He told her he would bear the consequence of his own decisions and would not lay them at her feet. The steadiness of his voice mattered. It did not promise comfort, it promised responsibility. Violet exhaled, a measured release she did not disguise. She nodded once. The reckoning she had demanded had been met. When she moved to sit, it was not in retreat, but in acceptance. What followed would test them both. Yet for the first time, Violet understood that staying did not require her to diminish herself. It required her to stand, openly, within a choice that had finally been spoken aloud. What followed Violet's acceptance was not the rush of triumph she might once have imagined, but a quieter reckoning that felt far more enduring. The house did not change overnight, neither did the world beyond its doors. Instead, consequence arrived in subtle increments, testing resolve rather than spectacle. Violet sensed it the next morning as she dressed in a soft ivory day gown with warmer undertones than before, the fabric refined, the cut assured. Her hair was arranged with deliberate elegance, pinned into a classical knot with gentle curls framing her face, a style that acknowledged visibility without apology. She was no longer dressing to disappear, she was dressing to remain. Edwin met her at breakfast, not as protector, but as partner. There was no display, no announcement, yet his presence beside her carried a new steadiness. Conversation flowed around them cautiously, the household attentive to tone and placement. Violet answered questions directly, her voice calm, her posture unyielding. Each exchange reinforced what words alone could not. She was not a curiosity, she was chosen, and she conducted herself accordingly. Later, Edwin addressed matters that could no longer be deferred. He issued instructions that clarified Violet's standing without isolating her as exception. Decisions were framed inclusively, responsibilities shared, authority exercised with intent rather than dominance. Violet observed the care with which he acted, recognizing the discipline beneath his resolve. Choice, she understood, was not declared once, it was practiced. Emotionally, Violet felt the shift deepen within her. Fear did not vanish, but it no longer governed her movement. She was aware of scrutiny, of resistance that would surface again, yet she did not brace for retreat. Instead, she measured her ground and stood upon it. The endurance that had once defined her transformed into something quieter and stronger. She was no longer surviving proximity to power, she was sharing it. In the afternoon, Edwin joined her briefly in the library, their exchange unremarkable in content but profound in implication. They spoke of ordinary matters, of arrangements and obligations, and the simplicity of it felt earned. Violet realized then that love, as it was forming between them, was not an escape from difficulty but a commitment to face it together without erasing oneself. As evening approached, Violet paused at the window, watching the city soften into dusk. She reflected not on how far she had come, but on how firmly she now stood. Her place had once been set far away, defined by tolerance and silence. Now it was claimed through clarity and choice. Edwin joined her there without ceremony, their shoulders aligned, the future uncertain but no longer undefined. They did not speak of forever. They did not need to. What mattered was already established. Violet had been chosen openly. Edwin had chosen honestly. The chair drawn out beside him was no longer a gesture of defiance. It was a place held with intention, and Violet sat within it, knowing she had not surrendered herself to claim it. Consequences did not wait for ceremony. Letters arrived edged with courtesy and caution, invitations adjusted, glances sharpened. Violet met the day in a soft sage green gown, tailored with restraint, her hair gathered into a classical knot that held without severity. She felt the weight of attention settle again, heavier now for being earned. This was not novelty. This was response. Edwin moved through the house with deliberate calm, addressing resistance as it appeared, neither provoking nor yielding. He corrected misdirection with precision, redirecting conversation, reaffirming decisions already made. Violet watched the pattern form and recognized discipline at work, not display. The steadiness mattered. It told her that alignment was not situational. Emotion tested her in quieter ways. Old vigilance surfaced at the edge of every room, urging her to anticipate retreat. She acknowledged it without obedience. Instead, she practiced presence, speaking when needed, listening when wise, allowing pauses to exist without filling them. Endurance reshaped itself into choice repeated. A visit that afternoon pressed the matter further. A relation questioned the wisdom of disruption, careful to sound concerned rather than critical. Violet remained composed, hands folded, posture easy. Edwin answered without deflection, naming responsibility and consequence with equal measure. The exchange ended cleanly. Violet felt the relief of certainty rather than approval. Later, alone, she considered the cost still to come. Acceptance would be partial, resistance persistent. She did not require otherwise. What she required was consistency, and she had begun to trust it. The trust surprised her most. As evening settled, Violet changed into a warm ivory gown with deeper undertones, her hair arranged with subtle ornament suitable to her standing. She entered the drawing room without hesitation. Edwin joined her, their greeting unremarkable, their alignment unmistakable. They spoke of practical matters, shared decisions, the rhythm of days ahead. Looking back, Violet understood that courage had not arrived as a single act. It had accrued through moments honored rather than endured. Her place beside him was no longer a correction to be defended. It was a position maintained through constancy. The world might resist, but resistance no longer defined her. Choice did. She knew the path ahead would demand patience, candor, and courage renewed daily, and she accepted that demand with quiet resolve, trusting not promises, but the practice of choosing, again and again, to stand where she belonged, without retreat or apology or fear, in full daylight there. Society turned its face with practiced subtlety. Invitations arrived that tested rather than welcomed, their phrasing polite, their timing calculated. Violet prepared for the evening with steady intent, choosing a pale gold gown that caught candlelight without glare, her hair arranged in soft ringlets pinned low, classical and controlled. She understood the purpose at once. This was not celebration, it was measurement. The rooms filled slowly, eyes weighing distance and alignment. Violet moved with composed assurance, greeting those offered, allowing pauses to exist without apology. When conversation edged toward implication, she answered plainly, neither defensive nor indulgent. Endurance no longer required shrinking, it required steadiness. Edwin remained beside her, attentive without hovering, his presence a quiet declaration that did not ask permission. Fatigue came in small waves. Violet felt it between exchanges, a dull ache behind the composure, the cost of being examined rather than ignored. She rested her attention where it mattered, on the firmness of her own footing, on the simple fact of remaining. Edwin noticed the strain and adjusted without comment, shortening engagements, redirecting talk, preserving her energy without diminishing her agency. A remark arrived, sharpened by civility, questioning whether disruption could last. Edwin responded calmly, naming responsibility and continuity, refusing spectacle. Violet did not look away. She met the room with level gaze, accepting consequence without dramatizing it. The air shifted, not toward approval, but toward recognition. That was enough. Later, in a quieter corner, Violet allowed herself a measured breath. She recognized the truth with surprising clarity. Acceptance might never be universal. It did not need to be. What mattered was coherence, the alignment of action with choice, repeated until it formed ground. She had that now. When they departed, the night felt earned rather than endured. Violet changed out of gold into simple white, unpinning her hair with careful patience. The mirror reflected composure touched by weariness, and she did not flinch from either. Edwin joined her briefly, their exchange practical, affectionate in restraint. As the house settled, Violet understood the work ahead would be ongoing. Visibility would demand discernment, partnership would demand honesty renewed. Yet she felt no urge to retreat. The chair beside him was no longer a challenge to the room. It was a fact maintained by consistency. In that knowledge, Violet slept without rehearsing departure, trusting not ease, but the shared discipline of staying, through silence, patience, courage, and resolve. The old fear returned quietly, without spectacle, as such things often did. Violet felt it first as a tightening rather than a thought, a subtle contraction when a remark drifted too close to her hearing during a morning visit. It was spoken lightly, with practiced concern, suggesting that resolve could wane with time, that even firm decisions softened under prolonged scrutiny. No one addressed her directly, no one needed to. The implication settled where implication always had, testing ground she had only just begun to trust. She dressed that day in a subdued pale blue gown, choosing restraint instinctively, her hair pinned neatly with deliberate care. The color felt like armor, calming and distant. As she moved through the house, she felt vigilance resurface, old habits reasserting themselves with unsettling ease. She caught herself measuring rooms again, gauging exits, preparing explanations she had hoped to leave behind. The realization stung. Courage, she understood, was not linear. It faltered. It required renewal. Edwin noticed the shift before she spoke of it. He recognized the signs in the way Violet's gaze withdrew, in the precision of her movements sharpened by caution. He did not press her immediately. He had learned, through care, that reassurance demanded timing as much as truth. Instead, he maintained constancy, addressing matters openly, reinforcing decisions through repetition rather than emphasis. Still, the distance she created unsettled him, because it echoed a pattern they both knew too well. By afternoon, Violet found herself alone in the library, the familiar refuge offering little comfort. She stood at the window, hands folded, wrestling with doubt she resented. Had she mistaken alignment for permanence? Had she trusted before proof could accumulate? The fear was not of losing him, she realized, but of losing herself again to waiting, to shrinking, to silence disguised as patience. Edwin joined her there without announcement. He did not ask what troubled her. He acknowledged it. He spoke of the pressure returning, of resistance that would persist, of the necessity of meeting it together rather than separately. His voice remained steady, his intent clear. He reminded her, gently and without insistence, that choice was not erased by challenge, it was refined by it. Violet listened, allowing the reassurance to settle slowly rather than seize it as relief. She spoke then, naming the fear without apology, admitting how easily old instincts resurfaced. Edwin did not diminish it. He accepted it as part of the cost they shared. The acknowledgement mattered more than reassurance. As evening approached, Violet felt the tension ease, not because doubt vanished, but because it had been met openly. She dressed for dinner, with renewed intention, choosing a warmer hue, her posture steady once more. The fear had not defeated her, it had tested her, and in meeting it without retreat, Violet understood that trust was not the absence of doubt, but the decision to stand within it, without surrender. The affirmation came not as declaration, but as certainty made visible. The occasion was formal enough to invite scrutiny, yet ordinary enough to disguise intent. Violet prepared with deliberate calm, choosing a deepened rose evening gown that carried warmth without excess, the color richer than those she once favored. Her hair was arranged in elegant Regency curls pinned low, controlled yet expressive. She did not dress for protection, she dressed to be present. The room filled with familiar faces and familiar tests. Conversation drifted toward implication with the practiced ease of habit, questions posed that invited qualification rather than truth. Violet answered plainly, her voice steady, her posture unyielding. She felt the old tension stir and did not obey it. She stood where she was, allowing silence to do its work when words would have diminished it. When the challenge came, it arrived cloaked in courtesy, a remark designed to question permanence without appearing to do so. The room waited. Edwin did not. He responded with calm authority, affirming Violet's place without ornament or defense. He spoke as though stating an established fact, because it was. The effect was immediate. The implication collapsed under its own exposure. Attention recalibrated. The room adjusted. Violet felt the moment settle with a quiet force that surprised her. This was not reassurance offered in private. This was alignment claimed in public, without hesitation, without appeal. Relief followed, then something steadier and more profound. Security, not comfort, not approval, but the certainty of being anchored by choice rather than tolerance. Edwin did not linger on the exchange. He allowed the evening to continue, refusing to grant spectacle the dignity of response. Violet remained composed, accepting the shift without performance. She did not need to claim the space. It had been affirmed. When their gazes met across the room, there was no question in it now, only acknowledgement. Later, when the gathering thinned, Violet felt the weariness settle into her bones. Being seen carried weight, even when grounded in truth. Edwin noticed and adjusted without comment, shortening engagements, preserving quiet. Their exchange afterward was brief and ordinary, yet it carried the ease of something secured rather than defended. As Violet prepared for sleep, unpinning her hair with careful patience, she recognized the transformation with unexpected clarity. The fear of impermanence had loosened its hold, not vanished, but diminished, rendered manageable by consistency. The chair beside him was no longer a promise. It was a position maintained through action. Downstairs, Edwin stood by the window, the city's lights steady beyond the glass. He understood that affirmation, once made, demanded renewal through conduct. He was prepared for that work. What they had chosen would not be sustained by declaration alone, but by the quiet discipline of standing together, openly and without retreat, as consequence followed. The future did not arrive with ceremony. It revealed itself gradually, shaped by decision rather than promise, by habit altered through intention. Violet felt the change in the rhythm of days, in the way her presence was no longer discussed but assumed. She dressed that morning in a warm ivory gown with richer detailing than she once would have chosen, the fabric refined without excess, her hair arranged with subtle ornament suitable to her standing. The choices no longer felt defensive, they felt accurate. Household life settled into a new order. Violet participated openly in matters once closed to her, her judgment sought and trusted. She spoke with calm authority, neither cautious nor performative, and felt the unfamiliar ease of being heard without needing to justify her right to speak. The endurance that had once defined her softened into confidence grounded in experience rather than approval. Edwin, for his part, redefined leadership without relinquishing strength. He no longer corrected injustice reactively. He prevented it structurally. Decisions reflected alignment rather than exception, and Violet recognized the care with which he maintained balance. Partnership, she learned, was not the absence of hierarchy, but the refusal to let it silence one voice in favor of another. Emotionally, Violet discovered peace that had been earned rather than granted. The fear of displacement faded into memory, replaced by vigilance tempered with trust. She no longer waited for the chair to be withdrawn. She expected it to remain. The distinction changed everything. That evening, they walked briefly together beneath the fading light, conversation quiet and unremarkable. No declarations followed. None were needed. The future was not imagined as escape or triumph, but as shared responsibility, accepted without illusion. Violet understood then that her place had not been secured by rebellion alone, nor by affection offered privately. It had been claimed through clarity, consistency, and courage renewed daily. Whatever challenges lay ahead would meet a woman no longer defined by distance, but by choice. The table that once excluded her now held space as a matter of course. The chair beside him was no longer symbolic. It was simply where she belonged. The final dinner was arranged with the same formal precision as so many before it, yet Violet felt the difference the moment she entered the room. Nothing in the setting had changed. The candles burned evenly, the table gleamed, the place settings aligned in perfect symmetry. What had changed was expectation. She wore a pale champagne gown, refined and luminous without excess, the fabric moving easily as she walked. Her hair was arranged in a graceful Regency chignon, soft curls framing her face, elegant without artifice. She did not pause at the threshold. She moved forward with quiet certainty. The chair beside Edwin was drawn out before any instruction could be given, before any glance could question it. The action required no announcement. It was simply done. Violet took her place without hesitation, her posture calm, her expression composed. No one spoke of hierarchy. No one corrected the arrangement. The room accepted what had already become fact. Conversation flowed with deliberate normality. Violet participated without restraint, her voice steady, her presence unremarkable in the best sense of the word. She was neither symbol nor disruption now. She was part of the structure itself. Edwin remained beside her, not watchful, not demonstrative, his alignment clear through constancy rather than gesture. The ease between them had been earned through endurance, tested by resistance, and secured through choice repeated until it became truth. As the meal progressed, Violet reflected not on what had been taken from her, but on what she had refused to surrender: dignity, voice, self. Her place had once been defined by distance, by tolerance measured in silence. Now it was defined by presence sustained without apology. The shift felt quiet, complete, and irrevocable. When the evening ended, Violet rose beside Edwin as though she had always done so. The room made space without comment. Outside, London waited as it always had, vast and indifferent, yet no longer threatening. Within those walls, something lasting had been established. Her place was no longer set far from his table. It was beside him, held not by indulgence or defiance alone, but by mutual recognition. Violet Renbury did not need to be invited again. She had been chosen, openly and finally, and she remained, not as exception, but as equal, where she belonged.